ZAIA のアメリカ支部の新しい社長を探してる。Mr. Shields, I entrust you will take the responsibility to ensure the future of ZAIA USA. Tim, I swear you in as the new CEO of ZAIA USA. ZAIA forever!
Howdy, Tim Shields, ZAIA America. Kamen Rider is a Western. I've seen this concept confuse many people over the years, so I've taken it upon myself to spend the past 8 months or so watching about 70 cowboy movies that are all vital to the timeline of the Western genre, scores of samurai films, 30s Disney cartoons, several of the works of Osamu Tezuka, Akira Kurosawa. And now, finally, months later, I feel like I have a strong enough grasp on the basics of the Western genre to walk you through this concept in a way you should be able to understand without having to deal with the hassle of watching all of this crap. We're in for one hell of a journey across a brave new frontier, so grab your ticket and hop aboard the train. Just, give me this video to set up some tracks so that we can actually go anywhere. Let's talk about how Kamen Rider is a Western.
Django, you must face another day. Django, now your lover has gone away. Once you loved her, oh, now you've lost her, oh, but you've lost her forever, Django. When there are clouds in the sky and they are gray, you may be sad, but remember they'll all soon pass away. No, Django, after the showers the sun will be shining.
What is a Western? What is a Western? Isn't that the $60 billion double-dollar loaded question? As we saw in the Momotaro video, sometimes definition can be a fickle mistress. Even the Western genre's most refined definitions still contain, to this day, a lot of clauses. Let's take a look, for an example, at how Wikipedia explains the concept, just to give us a frame of reference. The Western is a genre of fiction typically set in the 19th or early 20th century in the western United States, referred to as the Wild West, and depicted as a hostile, sparsely populated frontier in a state of near total lawlessness that is patrolled by outlaws, sheriffs, and various other stock gunslinger characters. Note the exceptions. Typically implies a standard, so we can effectively consider that set dressing rather than a core tenet of the Western genre, right? So we remove the part that comes after that, the set in the 19th or early 20th century in the western United States bit, and suddenly that definition becomes considerably freed up for interpretation, don't you think? Let's keep pulling this thread and see where it leads. A hostile, sparsely populated frontier in a state of near total lawlessness, patrolled by outlaws and sheriffs. That sounds very vague once we've removed the turn-of-the-century context, doesn't it? Is Fargo still the Wild West, despite the advancement of both time and civilization? Noah Hawley and the Coen brothers certainly seem to think so, and their franchise Fargo, much like Kamen Rider Rebus, is classified as a neo-western. The show Justified, based on the works of very prolific and well-established Western author Elmore Leonard, tells the story of a modern-day sheriff in modern-day Kentucky dealing with modernized adaptations of saloon shootouts and outlaw gangs. Dirty Harry is the story of a 1980s city detective who takes the law into his own hands to commit acts of vigilantism. So why does everybody keep calling him a cowboy? Frankly, I don't think that this is a case where a textbook definition is going to get us very far, so let's zoom in and take a look at the core components of what makes a Western on a storytelling front, by looking at the themes of the genre in a broader sense. Aesthetics. One of the most common traits of the Western aesthetic is a heavy use of saturated landscapes against contrasting shadows. This is interesting because it reminds me of how Ultraman, Kamen Rider, Super Sentai all will use unnatural coloration for the heroes to make them pop against the natural backdrops, which creates a very similar thematic contrast against the shadowy villains that they're set against. This is a technique that Shotaro Ishinomori would be very well versed in as a mangaka, himself restricted to the use of black and white to depict his stories, contrasting shadow against the saturated white of light, highlighting his designs in action. There's a reason that noir and westerns are such a natural pairing for creatives. And we see this aesthetic magnified further moving from the manga into the Kamen Rider Ichigo TV series. For years we've made jokes about all of the sudden jump cuts to quarries and deserts, but where did that come from? Its roots in the Western genre. The clip running beside me is a mix of riding scenes from Kamen Rider Ichigo and Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars. Please feel free to tell me if you can delineate between the two. These rolling hills, these desiccated deserts, these verdant patches of hope are very clearly common denominators. Which makes sense. The horse as a motorcycle is hardly imagery that's relegated to one Japanese 1970s show. I believe it was the poet John Bon Jovi who first spake the phrase, "I'm a cowboy, on a steel horse I ride," and I think that a cursory glance at biker culture over the years will infer to us a very uncanny resemblance to the aforementioned outlaw gangs of the Wild West. We even see this reflected in Ichigo's attire, which is a blend of the two groups. The racing stripe on his legs was absolutely a big part of biker and racing culture, but horse racing was also a big part of racing culture, bear in mind, before cars and motorcycles ever existed. His gloves are thick and durable, as if they're meant for reins instead of motorcycle grips. He wears boots for his long treks across the desert on his steel horse. His scarf is very representative of the cowboy kerchief or the serape that I was wearing at the start of the video. And of course, we can't forget about the armor. So now we have a Western basis for Kamen Rider in terms of visuals, but how did we go from this to this? And what does that communicate to us about what it means to be part of the Western genre? The answer, as so often seems to be the case these days, lies with the birth of the American superhero. Superheroics. We return to the second part of our earlier definition, a hostile, sparsely populated frontier in a state of near-total lawlessness, patrolled by outlaws and sheriffs. Around the turn of the century, America was finally stabilizing into the basis for what the country would eventually become, for better or for worse. As a result, its citizens were finally granted the time and the luxury to begin creating and enjoying art. In 1903, Baroness Emma Orczy released her story, The Scarlet Pimpernel, about a foppish aristocrat who secretly dons a mask to fight crime and smuggle his fellow richies out of the country during the French Revolution. This is widely considered the proto-superhero, at least in terms of how we view the archetype in the modern sense. Obviously, there's plenty of mythology about superhuman gods performing acts of justice in order to protect the common man for millennia prior to this story from 1903, but this was no god. This was a man, doing everything he can, holding on to what he am, pretending he's a Superman, and that makes all the difference. This lent itself quite naturally to the white man, of course, co-opting the iconography of the Spanish and native people that he had conquered, and the cowboy was quickly capitalized upon as the face of a burgeoning nationalist propaganda campaign beginning in 19th century literature and graduating to early 20th century comic books. As a fun aside, for those who have seen my Poitrine video, this means that the birth of the cowboy as a heroic archetype was basically around the same time as the Three Musketeers, so make of that what you will. However, despite this, in 1919 we bore witness to the birth of Zorro, the Masked Swordsman, who is effectively the Scarlet Pimpernel archetype, except that he's actually Mexican and he hates rich people a lot more, which I think are both good steps forward. He wore a mask, he rode a super special horse, he outfought scores of men in order to help the helpless, often from corrupt government officials. He left a calling card to inspire the masses. For all intents and purposes, he was Batman before Batman. This is why Bruce Wayne is often depicted as having been watching a Zorro film or stage play the night that his parents were gunned down in Crime Alley, if you were ever wondering what that was about. In 1933, we see this concept evolve, and I use that term very lightly, with the Lone Ranger. This is the story of a Texas Ranger who, along with 5 of his friends, one being his brother, is gunned down by a gang of outlaws. Surprise! He's discovered on the verge of death by a native named Tonto, who revives him using his, Injun magic. I'm not here to defend the Lone Ranger, okay? A lot of the Western material that we'll be covering does have very, very racist tinges to it. The same can honestly be said of tokusatsu, and I think that that's worth acknowledging in our reads. Also, this is where we begin to see the integration of science fiction and fantasy elements into the American superhero lore. And that's more where I was driving us. Looking ahead a bit, we can see examples of how this becomes part of the cowboy mythos through entries like Stephen King's Dark Tower, Masamune Shiro's Trigun, or the Chronicles of Riddick and Pitch Black. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. The point that I'm making here is that cowboys were not only formative to the American superhero genre, but they remained a part of it without ever losing their core identity, as you can see. So how did they pull that off? This is due to thematics. There is something unique about the cowboy that differentiates it from its contemporaries. Starting from roots that most Americans at the time would consider adverse, there is a humbleness and a commonality to the archetype that grounds them in humanity even when serving as its protector, making them ideal working-class heroes. The quote I always think of here is Stan Lee saying that Spider-Man could be anybody underneath the mask. Cowboys began as native in Spanish culture and were made accessible to whites over time as we, colonized those people, meaning around the start of the 20th century, the Western was already a genre with mass appeal across multiple demographics, read by children and adults alike, and that was reflected in the material even then, with series like Red Wolf and Lobo, not that one, and the aforementioned Zorro, catering to audiences outside of white people in a time when that just wasn't happening in media. That's our first Western theme, by the way, the destruction of class difference in favor of individual morality. The cowboy is an agent acting outside of established law and society, living on the outskirts of civilization by his own code of justice. Their presence serves to bring order to chaos through the implementation of their morality through action in the aid of a community. There is an emphasis on the ingenuity of one man outsmarting unscrupulous masses. Cowboys are often outnumbered, staring down posses and gangs and armies, with not but a horse and perhaps a single companion by their side, adding to the mythical nature of their repeated survival in deadly showdowns. Villains of the genre, on the other hand, are depicted as cowardly, corrupt, often in or employed by people in positions of power against the will of the people. They abuse their citizens, they steal their resources, indoctrinate them into systemic violence against each other, traditionally in the name of personal profit. Can you explain to me the difference between Kamen Rider's Shocker using vampires to drain the lifeblood of Japanese citizens, and Daniel Plainview from There Will Be Blood draining the oil from a small town and leaving it morally bankrupt? This is the fight for a pivotal moment in history. Our heroes, cowboys, riders, ride into battle representing the next generation. Seasoned veterans, weathered by the oppression and hatred of the past, fighting for a future where nobody has to become them again. They're a wave of progressivism that quells an era of conservatism, that lays the track for the industrialization of the country, hence all of the emphasis on the Industrial Revolution, a last great hurrah for traditional machismo before its retirement for an age of peace. This is why we see so many cowboys die or ride off into the sunset after accomplishing their tasks. In an era without war, what need is there for a warrior? Where does the man without a home go home to at the end of the day? Whence the man with no nation's nation? Oftentimes, their identities have been outlawed by society, oftentimes in service to society. To be a cowboy is to live outside of the world, to be othered, to be an outlier, something which I think anyone will be able to see the parallels of in how Kamen Rider depicts its heroes. Thematically, the classic Western genre is a longing for America in the rhetorical sense, or a halcyon state in a nation's history that never truly existed as it failed its people. It's the yearning for a glorious past that also acknowledges the atrocities of the nation. So what does this have to do with samurai? Well, they're the same fucking thing. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Ronin are just cowboys, and cowboys are just Ronin, actually. All of these genre tropes that we've just spent the past 10 minutes dissecting and defining in order to figure out what makes a Western a Western, yeah, it turns out it also makes a Japanese a Japanese. All the way across the world, at the exact same time that this shit was going down in America, Japan's storytelling was undergoing an incredibly similar transformation. Following the dissolution of the Edo period, there was a sudden and massive political shift away from the conservative and isolationist policies of the retired shogunate, and a push for modernization and engagement with the world outside of the Japanese islands. We also saw a very similar development in the world of trains, creating a very tangible representation of the nation's new focus on travel and exploration, mirroring that of America's westward expansion. It would be redundant to talk about the thematics of samurai storytelling, so if you would like to check that out for yourself, and I highly encourage you to always watch the media and form your own opinion, I'm going to put some movies up on the screen right now. Feel free to check those out. I think they'll be a good little starter pack for this discussion, and I really hope that you enjoy them if you choose to watch them. But Tim, if you're not going to talk about the thematic parallels of samurai and cowboys, why bring up samurai at all? Stylistic influence. If you're familiar with Kamen Rider, then you have likely fallen far enough down the weeb well that you're familiar with the Osamu Tezuka and Walt Disney controversy. If not, and you're watching this because this is a cowboy video, I am so sorry. This must sound completely indecipherable to you, but please allow me to explain at least this part in a little more detail. In the 90s, Disney released a small film, maybe you've heard of it, I really doubt it, it's kind of a cult thing, it's called The Lion King, which immediately came under fire for allegedly plagiarizing several design and story elements from Osamu Tezuka's manga and anime, Kimba the White Lion. However, Osamu Tezuka, somewhat ironically in the 50s, was similarly accused of plagiarism of Mickey Mouse for several design elements for his character Astro Boy, which is now considered iconic. For my money, I don't think that either of these read as plagiarism, at least not consciously or intentionally. Beyond the aesthetics, comparisons between these media tend to fall pretty short of each other, and frankly, the reincorporation of internationally famous mythology years and years and years after the source material is nothing new. Like, look at Rome's entire pantheon. To me, what this communicates is that America and Japan were beginning to interact, and this was being demonstrated in how our media intertwined to rapidly progress the evolution of both nations' art. And all of that is the result of that industrialization from back during the Edo period, from back during the Wild West. Isn't that fascinating? Throughout the 1900s, and especially in the latter half, there was a very similar intersection occurring between cowboys and the wandering samurai archetype, we're taken to the 1950s, where the tokusatsu gunsmoke is dominating television sets in America, and Moonlight Mask is making his debut as the first on-screen henshin hero. This brings us to the first major narrative shift in these genres. Traditionally, samurai were tools of the state, dogs of the shogunate, if you will, cannons to be pointed at the working class to keep them in order. And the narratives employing them glorified them into nationalist propaganda symbols, as we saw in America at the turn of the century with cowboys as warriors for America's border expansion. However, in the 50s came a new wave of Japanese cinema with a distinctly American flair, spearheaded by a man that you're probably familiar with by name if not by legacy, Akira Kurosawa. Seven Samurai, Rashomon, Throne of Blood, Hidden Fortress. These movies dripped of irony and cynicism for a national dream that never came true. While Americans were living in a utopian bubble of segregation and suburbia that was very quickly about to pop, Kurosawa was being chided by his peers for pandering to Western audiences in his depictions of Japanese politics and history. However, in 1961, Kurosawa would release the film Yojimbo, a story of a Ronin pitting two sides of a civil war against each other in aid of the lower class that they were exploiting, and it made an impact, both in America and somewhere else, that would join these two philosophies in the middle.
Italy, 1965.
So it's 1965, you're Sergio Leone, you're in Italy, you got a nice pizza pie, you're going to the movies, you're getting your culture on, and suddenly, boom, you just watched Yojimbo and you fucking loved it. What are you gonna do? Obviously remake it. This, by the way, does set our precedent. Yes, foreign films can in fact be Western genre films, and in fact several of the most important and definitive entries in the entire genre are foreign films, such as The Man with No Name. In 1965, Sergio Leone released a loose remake of Yojimbo called A Fistful of Dollars, the first of the Men with No Name trilogy. Starring Clint Eastwood, it tells the same story as Yojimbo, but in a much more bombastic and dynamic and, well, frankly, much more Italian cinema sort of way. I don't mean that as a pejorative, by the way. All I mean is that we can see from similar entries around the time, such as the works of Dario Argento or Lucio Fulci, that Italian cinema leaned very heavily into dramatic stylization through practical effects, much like kabuki or no theater. Surprise, I've brought those up again, which lent itself easily to the already grounded tokusatsu filmmaking tactics of Western and Ronin filmmaking. It was a match made in Madrid. The movie was shot in Spain, is what I mean. It turns out that the phrase spaghetti western is a bit of a misnomer. It just means that it was an Italian production, not necessarily that it was made in Italy, which is something that I'm learning as I make this video, so we're all on our own journeys, am I right? We'll be taking a much closer look at how this trilogy influenced Ichigo as a television series directly in part 2 of this series, but for now allow me to run through some basic rider tropes that we see employed in this 1965 classic. An abandonment of the legacy of Yojimbo's protagonist in favor of a mysterious lead that we come to learn more about over time. Our hero takes up residence in a small local business, complete with a quirky sidecast that is constantly cycling in and out. Several comedy beats across all three films, where the characters engage in over-exaggerated physical gags and mugging. Protracted riding shots set against backdrops of open countryside. A lone vigilante hero fighting a corrupt organization preying on the citizens of a small town by outsmarting masses of foes and rallying their community. Mentor figures with a moral compass and blue-collar wisdom. Quick-draw showdowns, which are effectively the henshin sequence and the rider kick compacted into one moment of explosive violence. Anachronistic protagonists with supernatural levels of skill. Ponchos. The glorification of pioneer culture scaled against the recognition of the reality of pioneers as an exploited fodder class for the elites. The presence of an overwhelming military technological advantage, be it a Gatling gun or an evil driver. Political manipulation of the masses, often through mainstream media. Civil philosophical discussions between the heroes and the villains. a soft spot for children, fighting for the disenfranchised, the absence of home and the importance of found family, something especially core to the works of Shotaro Ishinomori due to his own family struggles. Dusk riding shots and the implementation of lights and rider helmets in order to amplify the classic Western silhouette. Fighting other cowboys, much like how riders will fight other riders. Carrying from that, they share the same power source as their villains, a gun and ingenuity, with the focus often being placed on how they choose to apply the same talents differently. The physical destruction of the old establishment to make way for the revolution. The acknowledgement of the sins of a nation's past and the corruptive and destructive effect that it's had on the citizens in the future. Armor. A belt upgrade for the finale, symbolizing growth both as a person and as a weapon for social justice. Giant clouds of smoke as our hero makes his debut. A distrust of the government. The redemption of the anti-hero in the face of the natural conclusion to their violence. Bidding farewell at the end in favor of new horizons, with the hope of one day meeting again. So as you can see, it's not like I'm basing it off of like a couple of similarities. There's quite a bit here. But Tim, this is an Italian movie from Spain. How would that have influenced Kamen Rider? It's not like Ishinomori saw it, or fucking did he? Remember what I was saying about Japan starting to look outside of itself? Well, it turns out that Kurosawa-san saw what Mr. Leone was doing with his material and slapped his ass with a lawsuit, Woo Young Woo styles. It was a long and ugly battle, but eventually Kurosawa walked away with distribution rights. Exclusively in Japan. And distribute it he did. I don't want to mince words. From what I understand, my dude just showed it everywhere he could for pretty cheap. Basically, he was just trying to make some bank off of it and smear Sergio Leone's name in Japan. It's all pretty petty, but like, at the end of the day, I think it's kind of the best case scenario. He got a little bit of money for coming up with the premise. Sergio Leone got a lot of money for redefining it into something that personally I feel is greater, and interestingly, it debuted in Japan just in time for Shotaro Ishinomori to have seen it when he needed inspiration to come up with a little character named Takeshi Hongo. Did A Fistful of Dollars directly influence Kamen Rider Ichigo's TV show, which needed 90-plus episodes based off of what can really only be a 3-volume manga, I say looking at the tome? Unfortunately, we don't have a direct answer for that, and we probably never will. Unfortunately, Shotaro Ishinomori is very long dead, rest in peace king, and as far as I've been able to dig up, nobody thought to ask him about this while he was still around. But I do think that I've assembled enough circumstantial evidence to make a case for it, and I'll be doing that in part 2 of this little series that I'm doing, where we examine Ichigo's television show against the Man with No Name trilogy in greater detail. But regardless of whether any one movie influenced any one show, I think we can agree that Kamen Rider has been hugely shaped by the shared themes of the Western Ronin genre, itself far from limited to the works of Sergio Leone any more than Kamen Rider is limited to the works of Shotaro Ishinomori. So what other similarities can we find moving forward in the genre's evolution, and what can they tell us about the evolution of Kamen Rider as it exists today? In the Man with No Name trilogy, we saw the death of the classic Western... Collar! In the Man with No Name trilogy, we saw the death of the classic Western, a genre which had been floundering in the wake of the 60s anti-establishment movement already. In light of Vietnam, people were waking up to the hypocrisy of the American dream being built on the backs of the working man. The Black Civil Rights Movement was picking up steam. A new shockwave of abstract art permeated the culture of the nation. This set the stage perfectly for Sergio Leone's rock and roll Western superhero flicks. They were a snarling rejection of the established status quo, a new generation of gritty cynicism deconstructing America's perspective on its colonial history. Suddenly, cowboys went from a nationalist propaganda piece to being heroes of the lower class, the disenfranchised, rebelling against antiquated power structures in a condemnation of war. The New Frontier, as JFK would have referred to it, came to represent the American dream falling to poverty, failure, disgrace. It emphasized the importance of community in favor of isolation. Let's expand on that last point as an example. Following A Fistful of Dollars, we would see For a Few Dollars More, as well as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which introduced the primary and tertiary rider dynamics, with all of the rivalry and homoeroticism that we would expect to see from a modern Kamen Rider interpretation of this relationship. And of course, ultimately our goal is to move past the works of Sergio Leone and into those that he directly inspired, with the death, transformation, and rebirth of the American Western cowboy. This is where Rider happens. El Topo by Jodorowsky elevated the Western genre to high art through using the cowboy and landscape as symbolism, again drawing parallels to Kabuki and No Theater, the Western genre's roots. We see this reflected in Kamen Rider in how the transformation devices and henshin toys will be reflective of both the characters and the journeys that they're making in their self-criticism. Franco Nero's Django, which was itself made to capitalize off of the Man with No Name trilogy, spawned a wave of imitators that clearly influenced its Japanese counterparts, Zatoichi and Lone Wolf and Cub, the serialized filmographies of all three series numbering into the double digits. The way that other authors would take the character and replace the actor, the setting, the stories, that reminds us of how Kamen Rider will reboot every year and do the exact same thing, no? It's easy to read the influence of a director like Sam Peckinpah into works like Kamen Rider Amazon with his brutal, expressionistic, chaotic violence as a rejection of the American mythology in the Vietnam War. How many times in Rider have we seen a former hero outlive their purpose and die a relic, unable to adapt? Heroes who represent toxic masculinity and its consumptive effects on both sides of a conflict, resulting in the death of each side at each other's hands. Robert Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller de-emphasized violence, showing it as dirty and sad and depressed. Civilization slowly marches towards progress at the expense of the health of the people, making for a very nihilistic view of war that pairs nicely with something like the Ghost Ichigo movie or Kamen Rider Build. We saw a short death of the genre in the 80s as Star Wars debuted and the mainstream zeitgeist shifted to more fantastic and science fiction elements, which I think nicely reflects the very similar gap in Kamen Rider content between Black RX and the Heisei movies. Samurai were similarly being given less spotlight in favor of animated OAVs, allowing for previously unseen worlds and spectacles. But as we all know, nothing can kill Kamen Rider. It wasn't until, funnily enough, Clint Eastwood himself would make a return to the genre that the Western began to make a return to American culture. His film Unforgiven, which has since been remade into a samurai flick from 2013 starring Godzilla's Ken Watanabe, presented a cold, nihilistic world not of heroes, but of weaklings and liars and sinners. It's a starkly cruel counterpoint to the idealism of the genre's roots in the glorification of atrocity, a middle finger to concurrent feel-good white savior flicks of the time like Dances with Wolves. And then 9/11 happened. Many Americans, for the first time ever, realized the fear that the American cowboy had been inflicting on other countries for centuries to this point. We didn't like it, and our media reflected that. This was the birth of the neo-Western, and in my opinion, this is where Kamen Rider begins to contribute its own ideas to the conversation of the Western genre. Cormac McCarthy released the book No Country for Old Men, which was quickly adapted by the aforementioned Coen brothers into a new movie. It was critical of America, and it scaled beautiful vistas against cold and realistic and disgusting ultraviolence as a cautionary tale. The film serves as a perversion of the moral code of the cowboy in the name of justification of the protagonist's atrocity, with him being a serial killer and all. People die in an instant with no drama, like the opposite of the protracted showdowns that we saw earlier in the Western's development. Our protagonist is a horror movie monster, a murderer looking for an excuse to kill. Nobody matters to him. Life is simply a coin flip. The Western genre is dead, and everybody in this film knows it. Violence is sudden and everywhere, and there's not a goddamn thing that you can do to prevent it. There Will Be Blood soon burst onto the scene as a non-Western. It tells the story of a self-made preacher man coming to a poor town to exploit it for his small business, and he is destroyed by capitalism as his enemy, the protagonist, and an even worse human being, prospers from his tragedy. It serves as a statement on modern capitalist morality as both characters exploit each other and the community around them for stake in the game of money, resulting in their mutual destruction by the end. In 2010, the Coen brothers would strike again, remaking the John Wayne Western classic True Grit, this time focusing on the subversion of old Showa morality in favor of genre evolution. Women are depicted as capable and in positions of power, no longer useless burdens, damsels, or prizes to be won. The lead's idealism overcomes the cynicism of her partners. Matt Damon serves as a caricature of a cowboy, all swagger and zero competence. It is very good, by the way. The characters set out in pursuit of an outmoded form of justice and are broken in the process as a means of eulogy for the genre. There's an overwhelming focus on death and the resolution of mortal affairs. However, where the neo-Western's deconstruction of its genre tropes chose nihilism and cruelty and a more grounded nature, Kamen Rider chose to hope. There is still very much the acknowledgement that things suck, that the system is scaled against us, that every day for the lower class is a struggle to survive in a world that wants us dead. But where Cowboys and Ronin would scowl and curse and take as many people with them as possible, Kamen Rider would forgive and teach and uplift as many people as possible. Where the American Western superhero became gritty and broken and isolated, Kamen Rider smiled and laughed and made friends. And I think that that's where the disconnect is occurring for most people. But does that difference in modern opinion of the genre actually mean that Kamen Rider, thematically or aesthetically, isn't living up to the Western genre definitions that we've looked at in this video? In my opinion, absolutely not. Thank you so much for watching. As always, a huge round of applause for our patron investors and board members, without whom this channel would not be possible. If you would like early access to videos, exclusive video series, your name in the credits, and access to a Discord for upcoming watch parties, please feel free to visit my Patreon or Ko-fi linked in the description below this video. Support starts for as low as $1. Thank you for your consideration. If you would like to stay up to date with the channel in real time, please feel free to follow me at @AdamatsuJanaito on Twitter. I'm also streaming on Saturdays and really whenever throughout the week I feel like it, so feel free to follow me over at twitch.tv/KamenRiderThouser if you would like to hang out and chat. The sub button and playlist should be coming up right now. If you liked the video, like the video. If you have a comment, I would love to hear it. Share it around if you enjoyed it. Hit the subscription and the bell button if you want to see me in your notifications. These are all free things that you can do to help a channel grow. But I'm afraid that's our time. For now, I've been Tim Shields, and when it comes to tokusatsu, I'm your guy.